Some moments change everything, and for Sheriff Walt Kinney, it happened the day a little girl's tears fell on his desk. Every parent's worst nightmare was about to unfold in the quiet town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, where folks believed their children were safe from the world's darkness. Walt had spent 30 years as sheriff, looking forward to retirement in just a few months. He thought he knew every soul in town and every secret worth knowing. But when 8-year-old Clara Martinez walked into his office that February morning, in 1947, her small fingers began tapping out a telegraph message that would shatter his world. He said it wouldn't hurt. She spelled out in perfect Morse code. Those 5 words revealed a truth so terrible it would force Walt to confront the one case that could either destroy him or give him the redemption he never knew he needed. What had happened to this innocent child that taught her to communicate in desperate code? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden floors of the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Office, illuminating dust motes that danced in the crisp February air. Walt Kinney sat behind his desk, running calloused fingers over the faded family photograph that had occupied the same corner for 8 years now. The faces looking back at him seemed frozen in a happier time. His late wife Margaret with her gentle smile, and his son Thomas, then just 16, standing tall and proud in his high school graduation gown. Margaret had been gone 8 years. This spring, taken by the influenza that swept through Wyoming that terrible winter of 1939, Thomas had left for college that same year, and their relationship had grown colder with each passing season. What started as occasional letters became rare phone calls, then nothing but silence punctuated by returned Christmas cards marked address unknown. Walt often wondered if his son blamed him for not saving Margaret, though the rational part of his mind knew there was nothing any man could have done against that merciless disease. At 58, Walt had given Cedar Ridge the best 3 decades of his life. He'd kept the peace not with the iron fist that some lawmen favored, but with the steady wisdom that came from understanding people's hearts. In a town where everyone knew their neighbor's business, problems were usually solved over coffee at Millie's diner rather than behind bars. Walt preferred it that way. He'd seen enough violence in the Great War to last several lifetimes, and when he'd returned home in 1919, he'd made a quiet promise to himself that his badge would represent protection, not punishment. The town itself had grown around the railroad and the mines, reaching its peak in the 1920s when the coal ran rich and the trains came through twice daily. Now, with the mines mostly played out and the railroad cutting back service, Cedar Ridge existed in that peculiar state of gentle decline that marked so many western towns. The population had dwindled from nearly 3,000 to just under 1,500. But those who remained were the sort of folks who planted deep roots and weathered whatever storms came their way. Main Street still bustled with familiar rhythms. Doc Henderson maintained his practice in the same building his father had used, treating everything from broken bones to broken hearts with equal measures of skill and kindness. Mayor Patterson ran both the hardware store and the town council, with the efficiency of a man who understood that in small communities, wearing multiple hats wasn't just common, it was necessary for survival. The bank, the general store, Millie's diner, and the church formed the heart of their little world, connected by relationships that went back generations. Walt's deputy, Jake Morrison, was 26 years old and eager as a hunting dog. He'd grown up in Cedar Ridge, played baseball with Walt's son Thomas, and returned from his own war service with a desire to serve his community. Jake had the kind of fresh-faced enthusiasm that reminded Walt of his younger self, though sometimes the boy's eagerness to prove himself led to complications that Walt's more measured approach might have avoided. The sheriff's office occupied a corner building that had housed the town's law enforcement for over 40 years. The jail cells in the back were rarely occupied except for the occasional drunk sleeping off a Saturday night, and the main office served more as a gathering place for folks with problems than a center of criminal justice. Walt's desk bore the scratches and ring stains of decades of use, and he'd grown comfortable with its familiar imperfections. His retirement had been planned for months. Come May, he'd hang up his badge and perhaps try his hand at fishing the streams he'd been meaning to explore for years. Maybe he'd travel some, see parts of the country that didn't involve chasing rustlers or settling disputes over fence lines. The town council had already begun interviewing candidates for his replacement, though Walt suspected they'd offer the job to Jake, who knew the area and had earned the respect of the townspeople. But on quiet mornings like this, when the winter light slanted through the windows just so, Walt sometimes wondered what he'd do with all those empty hours. Margaret had always talked about the traveling they'd do when he retired, the grandchildren they'd spoil, the garden they'd plant together. Those dreams had died with her, and Walt had never quite figured out how to dream new ones. The Martinez family had been part of Cedar Ridge's fabric for as long as anyone could remember. Maria Martinez, now in her 70s, had raised 6 children and buried a husband lost in a mining accident 20 years ago. When her daughter Elena and son-in-law Roberto died in a car accident outside Cheyenne 2 years ago, Maria had taken in their 8-year-old daughter Clara without hesitation. Despite her advancing age and limited means, Clara was an unusual child, quiet and observant in ways that suggested depths beyond her years. Walt had noticed her around town, always polite when spoken to, but there was something in her dark eyes that spoke of old wounds and careful watching. She helped her grandmother with the washing and mending that Maria took in to supplement her small pension, and Walt had often seen the girl walking to school with a seriousness that seemed too heavy for such young shoulders. The Martinez house sat on the edge of town, a small adobe structure that Elena's father had built with his own hands in the early days of their marriage. It was modest but well kept, with a small garden that Maria tended with the devotion of someone who understood that growing things was an act of faith in tomorrow. Clara's room was in the back, overlooking the garden and the open prairie beyond. Walt had always made it his business to know the vulnerable families in his jurisdiction. Single mothers, elderly folks living alone, children who might need a watchful eye. These were the people who reminded him why he'd chosen to serve his community rather than seek his fortune elsewhere. The Martinez women fell into this category, though Maria's fierce independence and Clara's quiet competence suggested they managed their challenges with dignity intact. Recently, though, Walt had noticed changes in Clara's behavior that troubled him. She seemed more withdrawn, more watchful, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. When he'd mentioned it to Doc Henderson, the older man had nodded thoughtfully and suggested that grief worked differently in children, sometimes surfacing in unexpected ways long after the initial loss. This morning, as Walt prepared to make his usual rounds through town, he found himself thinking about retirement again, but with a different cast. Maybe what he needed wasn't an escape from Cedar Ridge, but a deeper commitment to it. Maybe the wisdom he'd gained over 30 years of service could be put to use in new ways, helping folks navigate the changing world that seemed to be rushing toward them faster each year. The telephone on his desk rang, interrupting his reflections. It was Millie from the diner, reporting that someone had left a window unlocked at the school overnight. Walt made a note to check on it later, then stood and reached for his coat. The day's work was calling, and whatever the future held, he still had a job to do. As he stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk, Walt noticed the first signs of spring, trying to push through winter's grip. Ice was beginning to melt in the gutters, and there was something softer in the quality of the morning light. Change was coming to Cedar Ridge, as it came to all places eventually. The question was whether folks would meet it with wisdom or fear. Walt had no way of knowing that before the day was over, everything he thought he understood about his quiet town would be challenged by 5 words tapped out in desperate Morse code by a little girl who shouldn't have known such things. The photograph on his desk, the retirement plans, the gentle routines of a life well lived, all of it would be transformed by Clara Martinez's tears and the terrible truth they would reveal. The knock on Walt's office door came just after 9 o'clock, soft and hesitant. When he looked up from his morning reports, he saw Clara Martinez standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the bright morning light. What struck him immediately wasn't just her presence. Clara rarely ventured into town alone, but the tears streaming down her cheeks and the way her fingers moved restlessly at her sides, tapping against her worn cotton dress in a pattern that seemed both urgent and precise. "Clara, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Walt rose from his chair, his voice carrying the gentle tone he'd learned to use with frightened children during his years of service. But as he approached, Clara stepped backward, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to go deeper than simple childhood distress. Without speaking, Clara moved toward Walt's desk where the old telegraph key sat, a relic from the days when Cedar Ridge's sheriff's office served as a communication hub for the county. Walt had kept it more for nostalgia than function, but now Clara's small hands found it with the familiarity of someone who understood its purpose. Her fingers began to work the key with practiced precision, and Walt felt his breath catch as the familiar rhythm of Morse code filled the quiet office. Dot dash dash dot dash pause dot dash dot dot pause. Then the message that would haunt his dreams. He said it wouldn't hurt. Walt's blood ran cold. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd learned to read the signs of a child in distress, but this was something beyond his worst fears. "Clara, honey, where did you learn to do that?" She looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for her 8 years, then tapped out another message. "The man with the silver watch. He taught me." "What man, Clara? Who is this person?" But instead of answering, Clara pointed toward the window that faced Main Street, then shook her head violently. Her fingers returned to the telegraph key. "Can't talk. He might hear." Walt felt the careful world he'd built around himself begin to shift and crack. He knelt beside Clara's chair, bringing his weathered face level with hers. "Clara, I need you to know something. You're safe here. Whatever happened, whatever someone did or said, you're safe with me. Do you understand?" She nodded, but her fingers continued their frantic tapping. "Other children, too. He has pictures." Walt's hands clenched into fists before he consciously relaxed them. Whatever was happening here went far beyond anything he'd encountered in Cedar Ridge. "Clara, I need to talk to your grandmother. Can you stay here while I make a phone call?" The child's response came through the telegraph key. "Grandmother doesn't know. Can't tell her. Too scared." Walt reached for his phone and dialed the Martinez house. Maria answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the slight accent that never quite left despite her decades in Wyoming. "Maria, this is Sheriff Kinney. Clara's here at my office, and I need to ask you some questions." "Clara?" "But she should be at school. I walked her to the corner myself this morning. I know, she's here now and she's upset about something. Has she been having problems sleeping lately? Acting differently?" There was a long pause before Maria answered. "See, Sheriff, for weeks now she has nightmares, wakes up crying, but she won't tell me what frightens her. And sometimes I find her awake at night, sitting by the window, watching the street like she's waiting for something terrible." Walt watched Clara as he talked, noting how she flinched at certain words. "Has anyone new been coming around your house? Anyone showing special interest in Clara?" "There was a man," Maria said slowly. "Very well dressed, with a nice car. He came by several times, said he was from some organization that helps children who have lost their parents. He brought gifts for Clara, books, candy. I thought it was a kindness, but Clara always seemed scared after his visits. Do you remember his name?" He said to call him Mr. Henry. He had a beautiful pocket watch that he would show Clara. She was fascinated by it, but also frightened. I should have trusted my instincts, Sheriff. Something about him felt wrong, but he spoke so well, and he knew so much about Clara's situation. Walt felt pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to form. Maria, I need you to come to my office, and I need you to bring anything that Clara might have hidden in her room. Any papers, drawings, anything at all that seems unusual. After he hung up, Walt turned back to Clara. Your grandmother is coming, and she's going to bring some of your things. While we wait, can you tell me more about Mr. Henry? Through the telegraph, if that feels safer. Clara's response came in. Careful, measured taps. He knows about Mama and Papa. Said he could help me remember them. Made me promise not to tell grandmother about our special talks. What kind of special talks, Clara? Her hands trembled as she tapped. About being good. About keeping secrets. About what happens to little girls who tell stories nobody believes. Walt felt a cold fury building in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Clara, I believe you. Everything you're telling me. I believe every word. The relief that crossed. Her face was heartbreaking. She wiped her tears and tapped. He has a big house outside town, takes pictures, says they're for my family album, but they're not nice pictures. Where is this house, Clara? Past the old mining road, big gate with a lock. He has the key on his silver chain with the watch. Maria arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a small wooden box, and looking as frightened as Walt had ever seen her. I found this hidden under Clara's mattress, she said, handing over the box. I've never seen it before. Inside, Walt found a small diary with a lock that had been broken long ago. The pages contained drawings that made his stomach turn. Childish, sketches of men without faces, children in various states of undress, and symbols that he didn't recognize, but that filled him with dread. Mixed in with the drawings were notes written in Clara's careful handwriting, documenting dates, times, and activities that painted a picture of systematic abuse. But it was the final page that truly shattered Walt's composure. Clara had drawn a detailed map showing not just one house, but several locations connected by roads and marked with numbers. At the bottom of the page, in her 8-year-old script, she had written, "Other children here too. Some are very sad. Some stopped talking. Walt." Closed the diary and looked at Clara, who was watching his face carefully. Through the telegraph, she tapped, "Am I in trouble for drawing bad things? No, sweetheart. You're not in trouble for anything. You're the bravest little girl I've ever met, and you've just helped me understand something very important." He turned to Maria, whose face had gone pale as she processed the implications of what they'd discovered. "Maria, I need to ask you to take Clara somewhere safe for a few days, maybe to your sister in Laramie." "But Sheriff, what about this man? What about the other children Clara mentioned?" Walt stood and reached for his coat. "I'm going to find them, Maria, and I'm going to make sure this never happens again." As he prepared to leave, Clara ran to him and tugged on his coat sleeve. When he bent down, she whispered the first words she'd spoken aloud since entering his office. "Sheriff Kinney, some of the children can't talk anymore. They forgot how. You have to help them remember their voices." Walt knelt and took Clara's, hands in his. "I promise you, Clara, I'm going to help them find their voices again, and I'm going to make sure the man with the silver watch never hurts another child." But as Maria led Clara out of the office, Walt realized he was facing something far more complex and dangerous than he'd initially understood. The diary's map suggested an operation that extended beyond Cedar Ridge, and the sophistication of the grooming techniques described in Clara's notes indicated someone with experience and resources. For the first time in his 30-year career, Walt Kinney wondered if he was equipped to handle what lay ahead. But as he locked Clara's diary in his desk drawer, he knew that regardless of his doubts, he had no choice but to try. The alternative, leaving those children in the hands of monsters, was unthinkable. The search for Clara began at dawn the next morning. Walt had spent a sleepless night organizing volunteers and mapping out the terrain beyond the mining road that Clara had described. By sunrise, 30 men from Cedar Ridge had gathered at the sheriff's office. their faces grim with the knowledge that one of their children was missing and something evil had taken root in their community. Mayor Patterson took charge of coordinating the search parties, dividing the volunteers into groups of 4 and assigning each team a section of the old mining territory. Doc Henderson set up a medical station at the church, preparing for whatever they might find. The women of the town, led by Millie from the diner, organized food and coffee for the searchers, their efficient movements masking the deep worry that showed in their eyes. Walt had driven Maria and Clara to the bus station before dawn, watching as they boarded the early morning coach to Laramie. Clara had pressed something into his hand as she climbed the steps, a small piece of paper with an address written in her careful script. "This is where Aunt Rosa lives," she had whispered, "in case you need to find me." The trust in her voice had nearly broken his heart. Now, as the search parties spread out across the countryside, Walt found himself following the mining road toward the location Clara had described. Deputy Jake rode beside him in the patrol car, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the gravity of their mission. "Sheriff, you really think there's a house out here where someone's been holding children?" Jake asked, checking his service revolver for the 3rd time that morning. "Clara's been right about everything else so far," Walt replied, his eyes scanning the barren landscape. "That diary of hers showed more detail than any 8-year-old should know about such things. Someone taught her those details, Jake, and we need to find out who." The mining road wound through increasingly desolate terrain, marked by the scattered remnants of Wyoming's mineral extraction past. Abandoned equipment rusted in the morning sun, and the scarred hillsides told stories of dreams that had played out decades ago. It was perfect country for someone who wanted privacy, Walt realized, far enough from town that sounds wouldn't carry, isolated enough that visitors would be rare. They found the first sign of Clara's accuracy about 3 miles past the last active mining claim. A gate appeared in the road ahead, just as she had described, solid metal secured with a heavy chain and lock. Beyond it, barely visible through the morning haze, stood a large house that seemed oddly out of place in this wilderness setting. Walt stopped the car and stepped out, Jake close behind. The gate bore no identifying marks, no mailbox or address number, but as Walt examined the lock more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the metal gatepost were symbols that matched those he'd seen in Clara's diary. "Jake, take a look at this," he called, pointing to the markings. "Have you ever seen anything like these before?" Jake studied the symbols, crude drawings that looked like they might have been made by children. They looked like some kind of code. "Sheriff, or maybe like the games kids play when they're trying to communicate in secret." Walt nodded grimly. "That's exactly what they are. Clara showed me how she and the other children used these marks to leave messages for each other. Warning messages. They followed the fence line, looking for another way in, but the property was well secured. Walt was considering whether to cut the chain when Jake called out from 50 yards away. "Sheriff, over here!" Jake was kneeling beside a pile of rocks near a section of fence that had been partially damaged by weather. Hidden among the stones was a small object that glinted in the morning sun, an expensive-looking pocket watch with a silver chain. Walt handled the watch carefully, noting its weight and craftsmanship. The initials HC were engraved on the back, and when he opened it, a photograph fell out, a formal portrait of a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, wearing a 3-piece suit and standing beside an expensive automobile. "I know this face," Walt murmured, studying the photograph. "I've seen this man around town, but I can't place where." Jake peered over his shoulder. "That looks like Henry Caldwell, Sheriff. He owns the big house on Elm Street, the one with the fancy gardens. His family's been in Cedar Ridge for 20 years or so, made their money in railroad investments, I think." Walt felt pieces of the puzzle shifting into place. Henry Caldwell was one of Cedar Ridge's most respected citizens, a man who served on the church board and contributed generously to local charities. He was known for his particular interest in helping orphan children, often providing scholarships and support for families in need. The kind of man who would have easy access to vulnerable children and the trust of their guardians. Jake, I need you to head back to town and do some quiet research on Henry Caldwell. Find out about his properties, his business connections, his travel patterns. But don't let anyone know what you're looking for. If Caldwell is our man, we can't afford to tip him off. What about you, Sheriff? You're not going in there alone, are you? Walt looked back at the locked gate and the house beyond. I'm going to see if I can find another way onto the property. If Clara and other children are in there, they can't wait for us to follow proper procedures. After Jake left, Walt spent another hour exploring the perimeter of the property. Finally, he found what he was looking for: a section of fence near a creek bed that had been undermined by water erosion. The gap was small, but large enough for a determined man to squeeze through. The house, when Walt finally reached it, was larger than it had appeared from the road. 3 stories of stone and timber construction, with multiple outbuildings and what appeared to be extensive basement foundations. The windows were heavily curtained, and there were no signs of current occupancy, no smoke from the chimneys, no vehicles in sight. Walt circled the building carefully, noting the reinforced doors and the unusual number of locks on the accessible entrances. Behind the house, he discovered something that confirmed his worst fears: a small building that looked like it might once have been a schoolhouse or meeting hall, but had been modified with bars on the windows and additional locks on the doors. Through one of the barred windows, Walt glimpsed the interior of what was clearly designed to be a prison for children. Small beds lined the walls, and the floor was scattered with toys, books, and clothing that suggested recent occupancy. On one wall, children had scratched messages into the wood, the same symbols Clara had used in her diary, along with names and what appeared to be pleas for help. But the building was empty now, and Walt realized that whoever had been using this place had cleared out recently, perhaps as recently as yesterday, when Clara had first appeared in his office with her desperate telegraph message. As he made his way back toward the fence, Walt discovered one more piece of evidence that would prove crucial to his investigation. Lying in the dirt near the children's prison building was a small notebook, its pages filled with detailed records written in a careful adult hand. The notebook contained names, dates, and locations that painted a picture of an operation far more extensive than anything Walt had imagined. The final entry was dated just 2 days ago. Clara M. becoming problematic. May need to relocate operation earlier than planned. Contact associates in Colorado and Montana territories. Walt pocketed the notebook and headed back toward town, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. Henry Caldwell wasn't just a local predator. He was part of an organized network that moved children between territories, staying ahead of law enforcement through careful planning and influential connections. As he drove back to Cedar Ridge, Walt realized that protecting Clara and the other children would require more than just local law enforcement resources. But with his retirement just months away and his experience limited to small-town peacekeeping, he wondered if he had the skills necessary to take on an enemy this sophisticated and dangerous. The Cedar Ridge telegraph station had been abandoned for 5 years, its purpose made obsolete by improved telephone service and changing communication needs. Walt had walked past the weathered building countless times without giving it much. He thought, but now, armed with Clara's diary and the notebook he'd found at Caldwell's property, he saw it through different eyes. The building sat on the outskirts of town, connected to the railroad line that still carried occasional freight trains through the valley. Its isolation made it perfect for clandestine activities, and as Walt forced open the rusted lock on the front door, he discovered that someone had indeed been making use of the abandoned facility. Inside, the old telegraph equipment had been maintained and modernized. Multiple telegraph keys were arranged on a central table, each connected to wires that ran to different parts of the building. But what caught Walt's attention immediately was the logbook that lay open beside the equipment. Page after page of coded messages that had been transmitted over the past several months. Walt sat down at the table and began deciphering the messages using the code key he'd found in Clara's diary. What he discovered made his hands shake with rage and determination. The telegraph station had been used as a coordination center for an operation that moved children between locations across 3 states. Messages documented pickup and delivery. Schedules described individual children by age and physical characteristics and coordinated payments between various participants in the network. One series of messages from the previous week particularly caught his attention. Package delivery. Delayed. Local interest increasing. Request authorization for emergency relocation. Authorization granted. Implement Protocol 7 immediately. All assets to be transferred to Mountain Facility by week's end. Acknowledge Protocol 7. Clara M. Situation. Contained. Will monitor local law enforcement response. Walt realized that Caldwell and his associates had been watching him since Clara first appeared in his office. They knew about his investigation and had taken steps to stay ahead of him. But they had also made a crucial mistake. In their haste to clear out the main facility, they had left behind evidence that revealed the full scope of their operation. Jake returned to the telegraph station just as Walt was finishing his review of the logbook. The young deputy's face was pale with exhaustion and worry. "Sheriff, I found some disturbing information about Henry Caldwell. His railroad investments aren't just financial. He actually owns controlling interests in several freight companies that operate between here and Colorado. That would give him access to transportation networks and scheduling information that would be perfect for moving people without detection." Walt looked up from the logbook. "It gets worse, Jake. According to these messages, Caldwell isn't operating alone. There's a whole network of people involved in this, some here in Cedar Ridge, some in other towns, and they've been using children's own communication methods to coordinate their activities." Jake studied the coded messages over Walt's shoulder. "How many children do you think they've taken, Sheriff, based on these records? At least 30 over the past year, maybe more. And Jake, some of these messages suggest that not all the children survived their captivity." The weight of that realization settled on both men, like a physical burden. Walt closed the logbook and stood up, his joints protesting after hours of hunched reading. "We need to get Doc Henderson over here," he said. "If we're going to build a case that will hold up in court, we need someone with medical training to document what we've found. And Jake, from now on, we don't discuss this investigation with anyone else in town until we know who we can trust." "You think someone else in Cedar Ridge is involved?" Walt pointed to one of the coded messages in the logbook. "This message from last week mentions a local asset who's been providing information about law enforcement activities. Someone in our community has been helping Caldwell stay ahead of investigations." Doc Henderson arrived at the telegraph station an hour later, his black bag in hand and his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible distress. Walt had worked with Doc on enough difficult cases over the years to trust his discretion, and the older man's medical expertise would be crucial in documenting the evidence they'd discovered. "Walt, in 40 years of practicing medicine, I've seen plenty of human cruelty, but this," Doc gestured at the telegraph equipment and the logbook, "this is evil on a scale I didn't think existed in places like Cedar Ridge. Doc, I need you to examine some evidence and tell me if your professional opinion supports what we're seeing here," Walt said, handing over Clara's diary and the notebook from Caldwell's property. "And I need you to be prepared to testify about what these documents suggest about the children's experiences." Doc spent an hour reviewing the materials, making notes in his careful physician's handwriting. When he finished, his diagnosis was unequivocal. These children were subjected to systematic physical and psychological abuse over extended periods. The medical details recorded here are consistent with the kind of trauma that would require years of treatment to overcome, if recovery is even possible. As the 3 men prepared to leave the telegraph station, Walt discovered one final piece of evidence that would prove crucial to their investigation. Hidden behind the telegraph equipment, he found a detailed railroad schedule that showed coordinated train movements between Cedar Ridge and locations in Colorado and Montana. The schedule was marked with handwritten notations that corresponded to dates in the telegraph logbook, a transportation plan that allowed the network to move children between facilities without detection. But it was the timing of the next scheduled shipment that made Walt's blood run cold. According to the schedule, a special freight train was due to arrive in Cedar Ridge that very night, with instructions to pick up cargo for transport to a facility in Colorado. "Jake, Doc, we may not have as much time as I thought," Walt said, showing them the schedule. "If this information is accurate, they're planning to move more children tonight. Children who may still be hidden somewhere in or around Cedar Ridge." Jake studied the schedule. "Sheriff, this shows the train arriving at 11:47 p.m. at the old freight platform. That's the section of track that's barely used anymore, perfect for a clandestine operation." Doc Henderson's face was grim. "Walt, if children are being moved tonight, we need to act immediately. Every hour we delay gives these people more time to cover their tracks and disappear with their victims." Walt nodded, but his mind was racing with the complexities of the situation. "We're dealing with people who have resources, connections, and advance warning of our investigation. If we move too quickly, we might save a few children, but lose the chance to dismantle the entire network. But if we wait too long trying to build a perfect case, more children suffer," Jake finished quietly. As the sun began to set over Cedar Ridge, Walt realized that the next few hours would determine not only the fate of unknown children, but also define the legacy of his 30 years as sheriff. The safe, predictable world of small-town law enforcement was about to collide with the ugly realities of organized crime, and Walt wasn't sure his experience had prepared him for what lay ahead. But as he thought of Clara's tears and her desperate telegraph message, Walt knew that regardless of his doubts, he had to act. The children couldn't wait for him to feel ready. Maria Martinez sat in her sister Rosa's kitchen in Laramie, her weathered hands clutching her rosary beads, while Clara slept fitfully on the sofa in the next room. The beads had belonged to Maria's mother, passed down through 3 generations, of women who had faced hardships that tested their faith but never broke it. Now, as Maria whispered prayers for the children she feared were still in danger, the familiar weight of the rosary provided the only comfort she could find. "Tia, tell me again about the other children," Clara had whispered before falling asleep, "the ones who stopped talking. Do you think Sheriff Kinney will find them?" Maria had promised that yes, Sheriff Kinney would find them and bring them home, safely, but in her heart she carried doubts that she dared not voice. The world seemed suddenly much darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and the realization that such evil could exist so close to home shook the very foundations of her understanding. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Ridge, Walt was discovering that Maria's fears were well-founded. His telephone calls to sheriffs in neighboring counties had revealed a pattern of missing children that stretched back over 2 years. Each case had been investigated individually, but no one had connected them into a larger conspiracy until... Now, Sheriff Bob Martinez in Carbon County, no relation to Clara's family, had been particularly helpful. "Walt, I've had 3 children disappear from my jurisdiction in the past 18 months. All were from vulnerable families, single mothers, elderly guardians, families struggling financially. The children just vanished. No trace, no witnesses. We figured they were runaways, but now that you mention this network theory, Bob, I need you to check your records for any mention of a well-dressed man with expensive tastes, probably claiming to represent some kind of children's charity or aid organization. Someone who would have gained the trust of the families before the children disappeared." There was a long pause before Bob responded. "Jesus, Walt. Yes, there was a man like that. Came around asking questions about the missing children's families. Said he was from some foundation that helped with burial expenses and grief counseling. Never left a card or contact information, but he knew details about the cases that hadn't been made public. Walt felt the familiar cold anger building in his chest. Did anyone get a good description of this man? Better than that. We got a photograph. He attended a memorial service for one of the missing children, and the local newspaper photographer captured him in the background of a crowd shot. I can wire you a copy if you think it would help. Send it immediately, Bob. And I need you to do something else. Check with the railroad companies in your area. Find out about special freight shipments, particularly any that might be carrying passengers without proper documentation. After hanging up, Walt spread a map of Wyoming and the surrounding territories across his desk. Using information from the telegraph station logbook and his conversations with other sheriffs, he began marking locations where children had disappeared. The pattern that emerged was chilling. A systematic operation that followed railroad lines and targeted communities where missing children might not receive intense law enforcement attention. Jake returned to the office with news that deepened Walt's concerns. Sheriff, I've been asking discreet questions around town about Henry Caldwell's activities. What I learned is disturbing. Several people mentioned that Caldwell has been particularly generous with families who have lost children, offering financial support, helping with funeral expenses, providing what he calls grief counseling for surviving family members. Let me guess, Walt said grimly. These families later had other children who went missing or experienced problems. Exactly. And Sheriff, there's something else. Caldwell doesn't just own railroad investments, he's on the board of directors for 3 different orphanages across Wyoming and Colorado. That would give him access to detailed information about vulnerable children throughout the region. Walt studied the map again, noting how the locations of Caldwell's business interests aligned perfectly with the pattern of missing children. Jake, we're not dealing with a lone predator. We're looking at someone who has systematically positioned himself to identify, access, and exploit the most vulnerable children in multiple communities. The photograph from Carbon County arrived by wire an hour later, and Walt's suspicions were confirmed. The man in the background of the memorial service photograph was unmistakably Henry Caldwell, distinguished, well-dressed, and wearing the silver pocket watch that had become his signature calling card. But it was Doc Henderson's return to the office that brought the most troubling news of the day. Walt, I've been thinking about what we discovered at that telegraph station, and I realized I need to check my own medical records. If Caldwell has been operating in Cedar Ridge for months or years, there might be signs I missed. Doc's review of his files revealed a pattern that none of them had recognized at the time. Over the past year, he had treated several local children for injuries and behavioral problems that in retrospect were consistent with abuse. The children had been brought in by various guardians, never the same adult twice, and always with explanations that seemed plausible at the time but now raised red flags. Walt, I should have seen it, Doc said, his voice heavy with guilt. These children were crying for help, and I was so focused on treating their immediate symptoms that I missed the larger picture. Doc, predators like Caldwell are skilled at avoiding detection. They count on good people like you, focusing on helping rather than suspecting. The important thing now is that we use what we know to stop them. As evening approached, Walt found himself facing a decision that would define not only the rest of his career, but potentially his entire legacy as a lawman. The evidence he had gathered pointed to a coordinated operation that would require resources and expertise beyond what Cedar Ridge could provide. But federal authorities would need time to mobilize, and according to the railroad schedule, children might be moved out of their jurisdiction that very night. The telephone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Clara Martinez, calling from Laramie with news that chilled Walt to the bone. Sheriff Kinney, Clara is having terrible nightmares. She keeps talking in her sleep about the train that takes children to the dark place. She says there are children hidden in Cedar Ridge right now, waiting for the train to come for them tonight. Walt felt his heart pound. Maria, where does Clara think these children are hidden? She drew me a picture, Sheriff. It shows a building near the railroad tracks, with bars on the windows and a door that locks from the outside. She says our children there can hear the trains coming, and they know what it means. After Maria hung up, Walt stared at the map on his desk with new understanding. Caldwell's operation wasn't just using the railroad for transportation. They were using abandoned buildings near the tracks as temporary holding facilities. Children could be moved into these locations quickly and quietly, then loaded onto trains during low-visibility nighttime operations. Jake studied Clara's drawing, which Maria had described in detail over the phone. "Sheriff, this looks like it. Could be the old railway maintenance building near the freight yard. It's been empty for years, but it would be perfect for what Clara described." Walt reached for his coat and service revolver. "Jake, I want you to contact the state police and tell them we need immediate assistance with a federal crime involving child trafficking. Give them all the details we've uncovered, but make it clear that we can't wait for backup. Children's lives are at stake tonight." "What about you, Sheriff?" "I'm going to that maintenance building. If Clara is right, there are children there who have been waiting too long already for someone to find them." As Walt prepared to leave his office, he thought about Maria's rosary, beads, and the faith they represented. Faith that good would triumph over evil, that justice would prevail, and that those who protected the innocent would find the strength to do what was necessary. He had never been a particularly religious man, but on this night, as he prepared to confront the darkest evil he had ever encountered, Walt found himself hoping that Maria's prayers would be answered. The railway maintenance building sat in darkness beside the freight tracks, its windows boarded and its doorways secured with chains that had rusted over years of abandonment. But as Walt approached the structure in the fading evening light, he noticed signs that someone had been maintaining access despite the building's derelict appearance. Fresh oil stains marked the gravel around what had once been a loading dock, and the weeds near the main entrance had been trampled by recent foot traffic. Walt circled the building carefully, noting that while the front entrance was securely chained, a side door showed signs of recent use. The lock was new, and the hinges had been oiled recently enough that they moved silently when he tested them. Through a crack in the boarded windows, he glimpsed the faint glow of lantern light from somewhere inside the building. The sound that stopped his heart was barely audible, the soft whimpering of a child in distress, followed by urgent shushing from what sounded like other children trying to provide comfort. Walt drew his service revolver and worked his way around to a position where he could observe the building's interior through a gap in the boarding. What he saw inside confirmed his worst fears. 5 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12 years old, huddled together on makeshift bedding in the corner of what had once been the building's main workshop. They were dirty, frightened, and clearly malnourished, but alive. An older girl, she couldn't have been more than 10, was trying to comfort 2 younger children who were crying softly. But Walt's attention was drawn to something else in the building that made his blood run cold. Near the children's sleeping area, a detailed railroad schedule was posted on the wall, with today's date circled in red ink. Beneath it, written in the same careful handwriting he'd seen in Caldwell's notebook, was a list of names and what appeared to be destinations. Colorado facility, 3 packages. Montana location, 2 packages. The sound of an approaching automobile made Walt duck back into the shadows. A black sedan pulled up to the building's rear entrance, and 2 men got out. Walt recognized Henry Caldwell immediately, even in the dim light. The second man was someone Walt had never seen before, younger, with the kind of hard edges that suggested familiarity with violence. "The train arrives in 3 hours, Caldwell was saying as they approached the building. "I want the packages prepared and ready for loading. No complications this time. We've had enough problems with the Martinez girl talking to that sheriff." "What about the sheriff?" the younger man asked. "Word around town is that he's been asking uncomfortable questions." Caldwell's laugh was cold and confident. "Walt Kinney is 2 months away from retirement, and he's never handled anything more serious than cattle rustling. By the time he figures out what he's dealing with, we'll be operating from our new base in Colorado, and these packages will be distributed to our clients. Walt felt sick hearing children referred to as packages, but he forced himself to remain hidden and listen. The information he was gathering might be crucial to prosecuting not just Caldwell, but the entire network. Besides, Caldwell continued, we have insurance. Our contact in the sheriff's department has been keeping us informed about Kinney's activities. If he gets too close to the truth, we'll know in advance and adjust accordingly. The revelation that someone in his own department was feeding information to Caldwell hit Walt like a physical blow. He thought about Jake's eager assistance, Doc Henderson's helpful medical examinations, even Mayor Patterson's coordination of the search efforts. Any of them could be the source of leaked information, and Walt realized that his investigation might have been compromised from the beginning. After Caldwell and his associate entered the building, Walt retreated to his patrol car to radio for backup. But when he tried to reach Jake at the sheriff's office, there was no response. The state police contact Jake was supposed to make had apparently not been completed. Either Jake had been unable to reach them, or he had never tried. Walt found himself facing a terrible dilemma. If he waited for backup that might never come, the children in the building would be loaded onto a train and disappear into a network that stretched across multiple states. But if he attempted a rescue alone, he risked not only his own life, but potentially the lives of the children he was trying to save. The decision was made for him when he heard the distant whistle of an approaching train. According to the schedule he'd seen in the telegraph station, the special freight train was arriving early, which meant Caldwell's operation was proceeding ahead of the planned timetable. Walt checked his revolver, said a silent prayer, and began moving toward the building's rear entrance. As he approached, he could hear Caldwell giving instructions to his associate about preparing the children for transport. Remember, they need to be conscious but compliant during loading. Use the medication if necessary, but don't overdo it. Damaged. Goods don't bring full price. The casual cruelty in Caldwell's voice steeled Walt's resolve. He had spent 30 years protecting the people of Cedar Ridge, and he wasn't going to let these children become victims of a system that treated them as commodities. Walt forced the rear door and entered the building with his weapon drawn. Henry. Caldwell, you're under arrest for kidnapping and child endangerment. Step away from those children. Caldwell turned with surprising calm, as if he had been expecting this confrontation. Sheriff Kinney, I must say I'm impressed that you made it this far. But you're making a serious mistake if you think you can interfere with an operation that has protection at levels far above your jurisdiction. The only mistake was thinking that a badge from Cedar Ridge couldn't reach you, Walt replied, keeping his weapon trained on Caldwell. Now, step away from the children. Caldwell's associate had moved to position himself between Walt and the children, and Walt realized that the man was armed. The standoff that followed seemed to last forever, but was probably only seconds. 3 armed adults in a confined space, with 5 terrified children caught in the middle. It was the oldest girl among the captives who broke the stalemate. Despite her obvious fear, she stood up and began tapping out a message in Morse code on a piece of metal piping, the same desperate communication method that Clara had used to cry for help. "Help us," her tapping spelled out. "We want to go home." So, simple courage of that message gave Walt the clarity he needed. Whatever the risks, whatever the consequences, these children deserved someone willing to fight for them. As the sound of the approaching train grew louder, Walt prepared to do whatever was necessary to make sure Henry Caldwell's packages would never be loaded aboard. The standoff in the railway maintenance building was shattered by an unexpected sound, the screech of automobile brakes outside, followed by the slam of car doors and running footsteps. Walt's heart sank, thinking that Caldwell's reinforcements had arrived, but the voice that called out from the darkness was one he hadn't heard in over 2 years. "Federal agents, building is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." The voice belonged to his son Thomas, though Walt barely recognized it, transformed by years of authority and professional training. Through the gap in the boarding, Walt caught a glimpse of several men in federal agent attire taking positions around the building, their movements coordinated and professional in ways that spoke of extensive experience with dangerous operations. Caldwell's face went pale, and his associate immediately raised his hands, dropping his weapon. "This isn't possible," Caldwell muttered. "We have protection. We have advance warning systems." But Walt was staring at the building's entrance in shock as Thomas Kinney stepped into the light, his FBI badge clearly visible on his coat. Behind him came 3 other federal agents, their weapons drawn and their attention focused on securing the scene. "Dad, step back and let us handle this," Thomas said, his voice carrying both professional authority and deeply personal relief. "Henry Caldwell, you're under arrest for federal violations of the Mann Act, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and operating a criminal enterprise across state lines." As the federal agent secured Caldwell and his associate, Walt found himself struggling to process what was happening. "Thomas, how did you know to be here? How long have you been working this case?" His son holstered his weapon and approached, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal emotion. "Dad, I've been tracking this network for 8 months. When reports started coming in about your investigation in Cedar Ridge, I realized you had stumbled onto the same operation we'd been pursuing from the federal level." Thomas gestured toward the children who were now being attended to by agents trained in dealing with trauma victims. "We've been building a case against Caldwell and his associates for trafficking children across state lines, but we needed local evidence to complete the prosecution. Your investigation provided exactly the breakthrough we needed." Walt stared at his son, seeing not the angry teenager who had left home years ago, but a mature law enforcement professional who had been fighting the same battle from a different direction. "Why didn't you contact me? Why didn't you tell me you were working on this?" Thomas's expression grew complicated. "Dad, I tried. I sent you letters explaining that I was with the Bureau, asking if we could talk about coordinating our efforts. But you never responded, and I assumed you were still angry about how I left things between us." The realization hit Walt like a physical blow. The letters. "Jesus, Thomas, I never opened them. After your mother died and you left for college without saying goodbye, I thought they were just more arguments about things I couldn't change. I have those letters in my desk drawer at home. I kept them because I couldn't bring myself to throw away the only contact I had with you, but I was too proud and too hurt to read them." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding crossing his face. "Dad, I've been trying to reach out to you for 3 years. When Mom died, I was angry and scared, and I blamed you for not being able to save her. But working this case, seeing what real evil looks like, I realized that you spent 30 years protecting people from things they never even knew existed." One of the other federal agents approached them. "Agent Kinney, we need to coordinate with local authorities about processing the evidence we've collected. The children will need to be placed in protective custody while we identify their families and assess their medical needs." Thomas nodded, then turned back to Walt. "Dad, this is Special Agent Clara Martinez, no relation to Clara's family. She's been coordinating the federal investigation into this trafficking network." Agent Martinez extended her hand to Walt. "Sheriff Kinney, your investigation provided crucial evidence that we couldn't have obtained through federal channels alone. Without your work with Clara Martinez and your discovery of the telegraph station, we might never have been able to locate these children in time." Walt shook her hand, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Agent Martinez, how extensive is this network? How many children are we talking about?" "Based on the evidence we've collected tonight, combined with your local investigation, we believe Caldwell's organization has trafficked over 200 children across 5 states over the past 3 years. Most of the victims have been recovered, but some cases remain open." Thomas added, Dad, the notebook you found at Caldwell's property contained names and locations that led us to children in Colorado and Montana who had been given up for dead. Your investigation saved lives in ways you don't even realize yet. As federal agents continued processing the scene, Walt found himself drawn to the 5 children who had been rescued. The oldest girl, the one who had tapped out the Morse code, plea for help, approached him with the kind of grave dignity that children sometimes develop when they've seen too much of the world's darkness. "Are you the sheriff who helped Clara?" she asked in a small voice. "Yes, I am. Clara is safe now, staying with her aunt in Laramie." The girl nodded solemnly. "Clara taught us the tapping code. She said if we ever saw a policeman, we should tap. It would help us because good people would understand and come to save us." Walt knelt to the girl's eye level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sarah Beth Thompson. I'm from Casper. My mama's been looking for me for 6 months." Walt felt tears he hadn't shed since Margaret's funeral, threatening to overwhelm him. "Sarah Beth, your mama is going to see you again very soon, and you were very brave to help the other children the way you did." Thomas joined them, his professional demeanor softening. "Dad, Sarah Beth and the other children are going to need time to recover from what they've experienced, but they're all going home to families who never stopped looking for them." As the night wore on and the logistics of the federal operation continued, Walt and Thomas found themselves working together for the first time in over 20 years. The partnership felt natural, as if the years of separation had been preparation for this moment when their different experiences and skills could combine to serve justice. Agent Martinez approached them as the last of the evidence was being catalogued. "Sheriff Kinney, Agent Kinney, we need to discuss the next phase of this investigation. Caldwell's arrest has triggered emergency responses from other parts of the network. We've got simultaneous operations happening in 4 states tonight, and we need local law enforcement coordination in several jurisdictions." Walt looked at Thomas, seeing his son clearly for the first time in years. "Thomas, I owe you an apology for not reading those letters, and I owe you an explanation for why I was so angry when your mother died. Dad, we can talk about that later. Right now, we have work to do. Will you help us coordinate the local aspects of this investigation?" Walt thought about his planned retirement, the quiet fishing streams he'd intended to explore, the peaceful end to his career that he'd been anticipating. Then he thought about Clara's tears, Sarah Beth's courage, and the dozens of other children whose lives had been saved by the night's work. "Thomas, I think my retirement just got postponed indefinitely. These children need people who understand that protecting the innocent isn't just a job. It's a calling." As father and son walked toward the federal command vehicle to begin planning the next phase of their shared mission, Walt realized that sometimes the most important cases came not at the beginning of a career, but at what you thought was the end. The federal command post established in Cedar Ridge's town hall buzzed with activity throughout the night. Maps covered every available wall surface, showing locations across 5 states where simultaneous raids were being coordinated. Telephone operators maintained constant communication with federal agents, local sheriffs, and state police departments, creating a web of law enforcement cooperation unlike anything the small Wyoming town had ever witnessed. Walt sat at a table, covered with evidence from Caldwell's operation, working alongside Thomas to piece together the final details needed for a comprehensive assault on the trafficking network. The ornate master key they had recovered from Caldwell's property had already proven its worth. Federal agents in Colorado had used Walt's description to locate and unlock 3 additional properties where children had been held. "Dad, look at this," Thomas said, pointing to a document from Caldwell's files. "This is a client list with addresses in Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. We're not just dealing with a regional operation. This network has been supplying children to wealthy predators across the entire country." Walt studied the list, his anger deepening as he recognized the implications of what they had uncovered. "Thomas, how do people like this operate for so long without being detected? Money, influence, and careful selection of victims. Agent Martinez answered, joining their table. They target children from vulnerable families, orphans, children in poverty, kids whose disappearances might be attributed to running away rather than kidnapping. And they build legitimate-seeming front organizations that give them access to potential victims. She spread additional documents across the table. Caldwell alone was involved with 12 different charities and orphanages. He used his position on their boards to identify children who would be easy targets, then used his railroad connections to move them between facilities in different states. Thomas added, the sophistication of their communication system is what really enabled the scope of this operation. By using abandoned telegraph stations and coded messages, they could coordinate activities across thousands of miles without detection by traditional law enforcement methods. Walt picked up Clara's original diary, its childish drawings now taking on even greater significance. Clara's courage in learning to communicate in Morse code probably saved dozens of lives. If she hadn't found a way to ask for help, Sheriff Kinney interrupted another federal agent who had been monitoring radio communications. We've got a problem developing in Montana. The raid there has uncovered evidence that some children were moved to a new location just hours before our arrival. We think there's a backup facility that's not on any of the documents we've recovered. Agent Martinez frowned. How many children are we talking about? At least 8, possibly more. And Sheriff Kinney, there's something else. One of the children, who was recovered in Montana, specifically asked about Clara Martinez. She said Clara had promised her that the good sheriff would come to save them all. Walt felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders. Somewhere, children were still captive, still waiting for rescue, still believing that help was coming. Agent Martinez, what resources do we need to locate this backup facility? That's where you come in, Sheriff. The Montana facility was operated using the same methods as Caldwell's Wyoming operation: abandoned railway buildings, coded communications, coordination with local accomplices. We need someone who understands how these people think at the local level. Thomas looked up from the documents he was studying. Dad, there's something else. I've been analyzing the financial records we seized from Caldwell's house. The money trail suggests this network has been operating for much longer than 3 years, possibly as much as a decade. How many children are we talking about over that time period? Agent Martinez's voice was grim. If the financial records are accurate, we could be looking at over 1,000 victims. Some have been recovered and returned to families. Some have aged out of the system and disappeared into adult lives we may never trace. And some... She didn't finish the sentence, but Walt understood the implication. The telephone rang, and Agent Martinez answered it with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned to Walt and Thomas. That was the operation in Colorado. They've recovered 15 children from facilities there, and several of them have provided information about additional locations. But, Sheriff Kinney, there's something you need to know. Some of these children have been asking specifically for you. Apparently, Clara Martinez managed to get word to children in other facilities that Sheriff Kinney from Cedar Ridge was someone they could trust. Walt felt humbled by the faith these unknown children had placed in him. How did Clara manage to communicate with children in other states? Thomas pulled out a detailed map of the railway system. Dad, look at this. The railway network that Caldwell used for transportation also served as a communication system. Children being moved between facilities could carry messages, and apparently Clara used her time in captivity to organize a kind of underground communication network among the victims. She was 8 years old, Walt said quietly. How does an 8-year-old girl develop that kind of organizational thinking? Agent Martinez smiled for the first time since Walt had met her. Sheriff, children are remarkably resilient and resourceful when they need to be. Clara Martinez may be young, but she has the heart of a leader. The other children recognized that and trusted her. As dawn approached, the scope of the coordinated law enforcement operation became clear. Federal agents were conducting simultaneous raids in over 20 locations across 5 states. Local sheriffs were providing support and local knowledge, crucial to the success of each operation. And at the center of it all, the evidence gathered in Cedar Ridge was serving as the foundation for prosecutions that would dismantle the entire network. But Walt's attention kept returning to the children, who were still missing, still waiting for rescue. The backup facility in Montana represented more than just an operational challenge. It represented the difference between success and failure for the children who had put their faith in the promise that help was coming. "Agent Martinez, I want to go to Montana," Walt said. "If there are children there who are counting on me specifically, then I need to be part of the operation to find them." Thomas nodded agreement. "Dad's right. The children in these facilities have learned to communicate in codes and symbols that require someone with experience in interpreting their methods. And frankly, the children trust him in ways they might not trust federal agents they've never heard of." Agent Martinez considered this for a moment. "Sheriff Kinney, the Montana operation is going to be more dangerous than what we handled here in Cedar Ridge. We're dealing with people who know they're cornered and desperate criminals. Make desperate choices. Are you prepared for that level of risk?" Walt thought about Clara's tears, Sarah Beth's courage, and the dozen other children whose faces now appeared in his dreams. "Agent Martinez, I've spent 30 years as a sheriff, and I've never faced anything more important than this case. If there are children out there who are counting on me to help them, then the level of risk doesn't matter." Thomas placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, we'll go together. The federal agents will handle the tactical aspects of the raid, but you and I can focus on the children, helping them understand that rescue has arrived and that they're finally safe." As the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, Walt realized that his career in law enforcement was entering a new phase. The quiet, small-town sheriff who had been planning his retirement was being transformed into something he had never expected to become. A specialist in the most evil crimes humanity could conceive, dedicated to protecting society's most vulnerable members. But as he prepared for the journey to Montana, Walt carried with him something more powerful than federal resources or tactical expertise. He carried the trust of children who had learned to believe that good people still existed in the world, and that sometimes, when everything seemed hopeless, help would come from unexpected directions. The ornate master key that had unlocked Caldwell's secrets now hung from Walt's key ring, a reminder that even the most carefully guarded evil could be opened by the right combination of courage, determination, and simple human decency. Somewhere in Montana, children were waiting behind locked doors, and Walt Kinney intended to make sure those doors were opened. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under a gray dawn sky as Walt and Thomas rode with the federal tactical team toward the suspected location of the backup facility. Intelligence gathered from rescued children had pointed them toward an abandoned mining complex in the Beartooth Mountains, 60 miles from the nearest town and accessible only by a treacherous mountain road that wound through terrain so isolated that screams would never be heard. Clara Martinez had provided the final piece of information that made the raid possible. In a telephone call from Laramie the previous evening, she had described a cold place with metal sounds where some of the older children had been taken. Combined with railway shipping records and financial transactions traced from Caldwell's accounts, the description had led federal investigators to identify the defunct Beartooth Mining Company as the most likely location for the hidden facility. Walt carried Clara's courage stone in his shirt pocket, the smooth river rock that she had pressed into his hand during their telephone conversation, explaining that she had carried it throughout her captivity as a reminder that good things still existed in the world. "Give this to the children you find," she had told him, "so they know that someone who survived came back to help them." The tactical team moved through the mountain forest with the precision of soldiers, but Walt found himself thinking like a grandfather rather than a law enforcement officer. Somewhere ahead, children were waking up to another day of captivity, not knowing that rescue was finally approaching. The weight of their hope and fear pressed on his chest as heavily as the thin mountain air. Agent Martinez monitored radio communications from multiple teams positioned around the mining complex. Sheriff Kinney, we've identified at least 3 buildings that show signs of recent occupancy. Thermal imaging suggests human presence in the main processing facility, which has been modified with additional security features. Thomas checked his weapon and equipment one final time. Dad, once we breach the facility, our priority has to be securing the children's safety before anything else. These people have shown they're willing to use violence to protect their operation. Walt nodded, but his attention was focused on the sound of children's voices drifting through the morning air, a sound so faint it might have been imagination, but which carried the unmistakable rhythm of communication. Thomas, listen. Do you hear that? The tactical team paused, and in the silence, the sound became clearer. Children were singing, not the joyful songs of childhood, but the kind of quiet, rhythmic chanting that prisoners use to maintain hope and connection with each other. They're using music as a communication system, Walt realized. Just like Clara used Morse code, these children have found a way to support each other even in captivity. Agent Martinez spoke into her radio, coordinating the final approach. All teams, we have confirmed presence of victims in the main facility. Remember, children's safety is the absolute priority. These victims have been traumatized and may not initially trust law enforcement. The breach of the facility happened with the swift deficiency of federal agents trained for exactly this kind of operation. Doors were opened, security systems were neutralized, and within minutes, the tactical teams had secured the building and apprehended 4 adults who had been operating the hidden facility. But it was what Walt found in the main holding area that would remain with him for the rest of his life. 8 children, ranging in age from 6 to 13, were housed in a space that had been designed to break their spirits while keeping them physically healthy enough to be valuable commodities. The singing he had heard from outside was their way of conducting roll call each morning, making sure that everyone was still alive and still fighting to maintain hope. The oldest child, a boy of perhaps 12, stepped forward when Walt entered the room. His eyes held the kind of wariness that comes from too much experience with adults who meant harm, but there was also something else. Recognition. "Are you Sheriff Kinney?" the boy asked in a voice that tried to sound brave despite its tremor. "Yes, I am. And you're safe now. All of you are safe." The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper covered with symbols that Walt immediately recognized as the same code Clara had used in her diary. "Clara Martinez told us to give this to you if you came to find us. She said you would understand what it means." Walt took the paper and read Clara's message, translated through her network of child communications. "These are my friends. Please take them home. They remember how to laugh, but they forgot they were allowed to. Please help them remember." Behind the boy, the other children watched Walt with expressions that mixed hope with fear. They had survived horrors that no child should ever experience, but they had also maintained enough faith in human goodness to believe that rescue was possible. Walt knelt to the boy's eye level and pulled Clara's courage stone from his pocket. "This is from Clara. She wants you to know that someone who survived came back to help you, and she wants you to know that there are good people in the world who will fight to protect you." As he placed the smooth river rock in the boy's hands, Walt saw something remarkable happen. The wariness in the child's eyes began to fade, replaced by the first glimpse of hope that any of these children had allowed themselves to feel in months. The moment of connection between Walt and the rescued children was interrupted by Agent Martinez's urgent voice over the radio. "All teams, we have a problem. One of the facility operators escaped during the breach and is heading toward a secondary building. Intelligence suggests he may be attempting to destroy evidence, or worse. Thomas immediately moved toward the door. "Dad, stay with the children. I'll coordinate with the tactical team to apprehend the fugitive." But Walt was already removing his sheriff's badge from his coat, looking at the worn metal star that had defined his identity for 30 years. "Thomas, I need you to take over here. Make sure these children get the medical attention they need and that they understand they're truly safe now." "Dad, where are you going?" Walt pinned the badge to the 12-year-old boy's shirt, the weight of the gesture not lost on anyone in the room. "Son, I'm going to make sure this ends here, that no more children ever have to go through what these brave kids have endured." Chew. Secondary buildings sat on the edge of the mining complex, connected to the main facility by a network of underground tunnels that had been part of the original mining operation. As Walt approached, he could see smoke beginning to rise from the structure. Someone inside was indeed destroying evidence, burning documents and materials that could implicate other members of the network. The man who emerged from the burning building was someone Walt had never seen before, but who clearly recognized him. Middle-aged, well-dressed despite the chaos of the morning, and carrying a briefcase that he clutched with the desperation of someone whose entire world was collapsing. "Sheriff Kinney," the man called out, his voice carrying a tone of forced reasonableness. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding here. These children were being cared for in a specialized facility for traumatized youth. Everything we've done has been perfectly legal and above board." Walt drew his service revolver, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "The only misunderstanding is that you thought you could hurt children and never face consequences. Drop the briefcase and put your hands where I can see them." Instead of complying, the man opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "Sheriff, you don't understand the scope of what you're interfering with. This operation has protection at the highest levels of government. Federal judges, state politicians, business leaders, they all have interests in maintaining our services." "I understand perfectly," Walt replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him for 3 decades. "You're part of a network that sells children to wealthy predators, and you think money and influence put you above the law." The man's composure began to crack. "Those children would have had nothing without us. We provided them with shelter, education, opportunities they never would have had in their original circumstances." Walt thought about Clara's tears, about Sarah Beth's courage, about the singing he had heard from the captive children that morning. "You provided them with hell, and you tried to convince them they should be grateful for it." "Sheriff Kinney, you're an old man months from retirement in a dying town. Do you really think you can stand against an organization with resources in every major city in America?" Walt smiled grimly, thinking about the federal agents who were even now coordinating raids across 5 states, dismantling an empire built on the suffering of children. "I don't have to stand against your organization alone. I have something you never counted on: good people who refuse to look the other way when children are in danger." The man made a desperate grab for a weapon concealed in his jacket, but Walt's 30 years of experience had taught him to recognize that movement. His shot was clean and decisive, ending the threat without allowing any chance for the man to harm the children who were finally, truly safe. As federal agents secured the scene and the last of the evidence was collected, Walt found Thomas waiting for him outside the main facility. The 8 rescued children were being loaded into medical transport vehicles, but each one stopped to wave goodbye to the sheriff who had kept Clara's promise to come for them. "Dad," Thomas said quietly, "the children asked me to give this back to you." He held out the sheriff's badge that Walt had pinned to the boy's shirt. "They said to tell you that they understand what it means now, and they want you to keep protecting other children who need help." Walt took the badge, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. But when he looked at it now, he saw not the end of his career, but the beginning of a new chapter. The quiet, small-town sheriff was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most important battles were fought not for glory or recognition, but for the simple principle that children deserved to grow up safe and loved. As the convoy of vehicles prepared to leave the mountain facility, Walt realized that he would never truly retire from the work that had defined the last weeks of his career. Clara Martinez and the children of Cedar Ridge had changed him in ways that made returning to a quiet life impossible. There would always be more children who needed protection, more monsters who thought their money and influence put them beyond justice. But now Walt knew he wouldn't face those challenges alone. 3 months after the rescue in the Montana mountains, Cedar Ridge had settled into a new rhythm that reflected both the healing of its community and its transformation into something stronger than it had been before. The trials of Henry Caldwell and his associates had concluded with convictions that would ensure none of them would ever threaten children again. The network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable had crumbled once its secrets were exposed to the light of justice. Walt Kinney stood in his office, the same office where Clara Martinez had first tapped out her desperate message in Morse code. But everything had changed. The walls now displayed commendations from federal law enforcement agencies and photographs of the children who had been rescued through the coordinated operations. His desk held not retirement papers, but correspondence from sheriffs across the western states who sought his expertise in identifying and investigating similar networks in their jurisdictions. Thomas had taken a permanent assignment to the regional FBI office, choosing to work close to his father rather than return to assignments in distant cities. Their partnership had evolved into something more than professional cooperation. It was the relationship Walt had hoped for during the years when pride and grief had kept them apart. "Dad, we've got another case developing in Colorado," Thomas said, entering the office with a file folder under his arm. 3 children missing from different communities, all with similar patterns to what we saw with Caldwell's operation. The local sheriff requested our assistance specifically. Walt nodded, studying the file. At 60, he found himself busier than he had ever been as a small-town sheriff, but the work carried a sense of purpose that made every early morning and late night worthwhile. "Have we heard from Clara Martinez lately?" Thomas smiled. "She called yesterday while you were in court. Maria says Clara is excelling in school in Laramie, and she started a program teaching other children basic communication skills, including Morse code. She calls it safety talking and explains to the kids that it's a way to ask for help when regular talking isn't possible." The transformation in Clara had been remarkable to witness. The frightened little girl who had appeared in Walt's office, with tears streaming down her face, had grown into a confident child who understood that her survival carried responsibilities. She had testified via closed-circuit video in several trials, her courage and clarity helping to convict not just Caldwell, but multiple members of the trafficking network. Maria Martinez had also found new purpose in the aftermath of the investigation. She had become an advocate for vulnerable families, working with social services and law enforcement to identify children who might be at risk. Her faith, tested by the revelation of evil so close to home, had emerged stronger and more focused on protecting the innocent. Doc Henderson knocked on the office door, carrying his medical bag and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just completed meaningful work. "Walt, I've finished the medical evaluations for the Peterson case. All 3 children show signs of recovery that exceed what we hoped for when they were first rescued." The Peterson case had been their second major investigation, a network operating out of abandoned ranch properties that had been identified using techniques developed during the Caldwell investigation. Doc had become an essential part of their team, providing medical expertise that helped both in building legal cases and in caring for rescued children. "Doc, how do you think Clara is doing, really?" Walt asked. "I know Maria says she's fine, but I worry about the long-term effects of what she experienced," doc settled into a chair, his expression thoughtful. "Walt, I've been practicing medicine for 40 years, and I've learned that children have a remarkable capacity for healing when they're surrounded by people who love them and make them feel safe. Clara has that, but more than that, she's found a way to transform her trauma into something that helps other children. That's the kind of healing that lasts." The telephone rang, and Walt answered to find Clara herself on the line, calling from Laramie with news that made his heart both swell with pride and ache with concern. "Sheriff Kinney, I wanted to tell you that we got a letter from Sarah Beth Thompson. She's doing really well with her family in Casper, but she wanted to know if there are other children who might need help learning the tapping code. She wants to teach them, like I taught the children in Montana." Walt marveled at the network of connection and support that had developed among the rescued children. They stayed in contact with each other, sharing their healing and their determination to prevent other children from experiencing what they had endured. "Clara, that's wonderful news. And how are you doing in school?" "I'm good, Sheriff Kinney. Really good. But I wanted to ask you something important. Grandmother Maria says that when I'm old enough, maybe I can come work with you and Agent Thomas to help find other children who need rescue. Would that be okay?" Walt felt tears in his eyes as he considered the courage it took for Clara to want to dedicate her future to protecting others from what she had experienced. "Clara, sweetheart, I think you would make an excellent member of our team. But for now, the most important thing you can do is be a kid, learn everything you can in school, and know that you're safe and loved." After Clara hung up, Walt walked to the window that faced Main Street. Cedar Ridge looked much the same as it had before the events that had transformed his life, but he saw it differently now. Every child walking to school, every family going about their daily business, existed in a world that was safer because good people were willing to fight for it. The new telegraph system that had been installed in the sheriff's office served both practical and symbolic purposes. It provided backup communication for law enforcement activities, but more importantly, it represented the community's commitment to ensuring that no child would ever again have to resort to desperate coded messages to ask for help. As evening approached and the streetlights began to flicker on throughout Cedar Ridge, Walt Kinney reflected on the legacy he would eventually leave. Not the quiet service of a small-town sheriff who kept the peace through gentle wisdom, but something more. Proof that ordinary people could confront extraordinary evil and win, that children's voices would always be heard by those willing to listen, and that sometimes the most important work begins just when you thought your career was ending. Outside his window, children played in the fading light, their laughter carrying the sound of innocence protected and hope restored.